Thank you, President Uribe. I think we all feel very honored to have been able to witness this speech. And President Uribe will be joining us for this panel on trade. So if I may, I'm going to call up the panel members. Fred, first, if we could have Craig Kelly, who is currently with the Cohen Group, but I should say, without going through his whole massive and impressive resume, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, has served as Principal Deputy Secretary of State since September 2007, was Ambassador to Chile, Executive Assistant to Secretary of State Colin Powell, a great public servant, and also a great believer in the future of Latin America-U.S. relations. Great, thank you for being here. Next, I'd like to welcome up someone well known by this community, Mr. Roger Noriega, twice appointed by President Bush and confirmed by the Senate. One of the foremost experts on Latin America policy. He's currently the visiting fellow in the prestigious American Enterprise Institute and managing director of Vision Americas. Thank you, Secretary Noriega. Welcome to the panel. Thank you for being with us. Jorge Arrizurieta, President of Arrizurieta and Associates, past President, Florida Free Trade of the Americas. So someone who has always seen the vision and seen the future of a more united commercial hemisphere of the Americas, appointed by President Bush to serve alternate executive director of the Inter-American Bank. Please welcome Jorge to the panel. Alan Gutierrez, National Executive Director of Latino Coalition, focuses on policy issues that affect the well-being of Hispanics, Senior Advisor to the Chief Operating Officer for the Small Business Administration and Office of International Trade. Alan, welcome to the panel. Thank you very much. Okay, what I will do is ask a couple of general questions to the panelists and get their reactions and hopefully get some discussion going. And then I will ask for 2 questions from the audience. So first, I would like to welcome the panelists and just talk very generally. How does trade, whether it's trade in abundance or the lack of trade, impact the economies of Latin America? And very importantly, how does our current trade policy impact the lives of Hispanic Americans living in the U.S.? Just to give the audience an understanding, and perhaps we can learn from some of these insights. Ambassador, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. To give one very concrete example about how trade can change a country, in Chile, the country where I had the privilege to be U.S. Ambassador for 3 years, between 1990 and 2007, Chile lowered its poverty rate from 44% to under 14%. During the exact period in which it was negotiating more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. And Chile did something more than negotiate free trade agreements. Before it began negotiating these agreements, it actually started lowering its own tariffs unilaterally, because the government knew that by opening up their doors, they would make their own industries more competitive and integrate their economy more effectively in the rest of the world. And this, I think, has served as an example of many other countries in the region which are doing similar things, opening their doors. And the effect, I think, on the United States is crucial. As you well know, Mr. Secretary, 42% of U.S. exports stay within our own hemisphere. So the integration of our country with the rest of the region is absolutely critical. Before I retired from the State Department, I used to say that at the State Department there are 6 different regional bureaus that cover the world: East Asia, Europe, etc. But Western Hemisphere is the one we live in. And so it's critical that we strengthen these trade ties. It has a direct positive effect on the people of the United States.
Well said. And you think that that would be very obvious to our policymakers in Washington. Thank you, Ambassador. Secretary Noriega.
Indeed, Secretary Gutierrez, if you look at just the trade agreements that we have in place, for example, there was a study in 2010 of 14 free trade agreements that we have in place. Our trade with those countries is about $1 trillion in exports, which means jobs for the American economy. And this study estimated that, in point of fact, these trade agreements doubled our opportunities with those countries. We see a very real-time problem today with the failure to ratify the agreement with Colombia. Canada has moved forward just in June of this last year. So there are $800 million in agricultural exports at stake, which can be easily substituted by Canadian agriculture producers, and which will happen. So this is really the hour when we need to press forward. There is some new momentum, new members of Congress who are committed to moving forward on these agreements, and I think we can consolidate our gains in the hemisphere, but we have to move forward, show some leadership, and educate the American people about the advantages.
Thank you. One of the things that we don't talk about often is that we do more business, more commerce with Central America, with the 5 Central American countries plus the Dominican Republic, than we do with India, than we do with Russia. So you're talking about very, very large numbers, above $45 billion of trade with our neighbors in Central America. Jorge.
Mr. Secretary, indeed, I mean, I guess the most succinct way to respond to your question is probably to point to the markets that have developed in California, Texas, and in Florida, which is not just because we are blessed with, or those respective communities are blessed with extreme geographic location. I think that's a blessing from above, if you will, that has been enhanced because in large part the Hispanic community, whether it's the working community or whether it's the entrepreneurs, have taken full advantage of taking it to the next level. Here in Florida, and that's back to your earlier point in U.S. production, among the comparative advantages that we might have had in suggesting that Miami be the permanent secretary of the Free Trade Area of the Americas Agreement, assuming it would have been completed, is that we had that location, but we also had, like no other community in the world, a demographic makeup that represented every single one of these countries, not only in person living in our community, but actually doing business with and for the countries south of here, and certainly Canada as well. So the benefit of free trade for the Hispanic community is perhaps duly benefited because we, more than the non-Hispanic community, understand how to trade with our respective countries. We understand the cultural sensitivities. We understand the idiosyncrasy. So for DR-CAFTA, which thanks to your leadership, and obviously that of President Bush and Governor Bush here in Florida, we were able to succeed with the overwhelming vote of one vote in the Congress. But thanks to your leadership, we succeeded. And to see a top-heavy pro-U.S. port agreement like the U.S.-Colombia agreement and the U.S.-Panama agreement, which are of extreme benefit, overriding benefit to the U.S. exporter, not happen is a great travesty, especially for the Hispanic community who understands how to take advantage of these agreements and who has historically taken full advantage of NAFTA, of DR-CAFTA, and the other free trade agreements that we have done in our country. So the terrain today, I think politically and economically, is perhaps the best terrain we've had to advance these agreements. These agreements are about jobs. Our country needs jobs. So for that reason is why I remain optimistic that if Korea passes in the springtime, it's going to be an excellent precursor for hopefully the U.S.-Panama Free Trade Agreement and the U.S.-Colombia agreement to be successful.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you for your efforts on the free trade area of the Americas. We came very close. We had 28 supporters, 28 supporting countries, not enough Yes, because that's the future. And eventually we're going to get there. So thank you for your service. Alan.
Certainly, to follow up with the panelists in terms of how important trade and jobs, I just wanted to kind of give you some perspectives as well in terms of, the census they do an outlook every 5 years in terms of the Hispanic business and what they're doing. And obviously when it comes out, the latest figures that they've done with the survey was in 2007. So we're talking a little bit outdated, but it gives you kind of an outlook of the importance of trade and how our neighborhood is the Western Hemisphere and how we continue to grow in Canada and Central America. But if you look at this, Hispanic businesses comprise, Hispanic businesses, think of these numbers, 23% of all businesses in New Mexico. They comprise 22% in Florida, 20% in Texas, 16% in California, and 10% in Arizona. Now, if you think about it, it's no surprise that all of them are across, our border states. And when we look at that is that, that is, the portal for our Western Hemisphere. Not only is Mexico one of our strongest allies in terms of trade, but as the Secretary mentioned, we need to look at, the more opportunity that we have. And there's no surprise why there's such a big population and a big composition of small businesses, Hispanic owned, that are continuing to grow, how the impact they do here in the U.S. and can continue to grow globally.
Thank you. One thing that I'd like to ask President Uribe to give us an insight from Colombia, from other countries in the region. The U.S. is not involved. The U.S. is not doing free trade agreements. What is happening, and how is the rest of the world taking advantage of the fact that the U.S. is not engaged? I'm talking about the European Union, China, Canada. Perhaps you can talk to us about how the vacuum of leadership that the U.S. has left, how that is being filled.
The case of Colombia gives us an illustration to answer your question, Secretary Gutierrez. We have already put in place the agreement between Indian Committee and Mercosur. And Mercosur has growing agricultural exports to Colombia at the expenses of the United States. We began negotiations with Chile much more late than that time when we began with the United States. And our trade with Chile has increased 4 times since then. We began negotiations with Canada 2 years after. We began negotiations with the United States. And last year, Canada, that is very demanding in human rights, Canada ratified the agreement with Colombia. We have already signed the agreement with the European Union. And I am optimistic that my successor, President Santos, will get the ratification of this agreement in the European Parliament. Therefore, in my opinion, the United States should no longer lag behind. The United States should catch up with these developments. And the more we promote trade, the more we can grow investments. And of course, if we grow investments, it is possible for suppliers of capital goods at the United States to create jobs domestically to produce capital goods. And in the issue of immigration, the more our people in Latin America perceive that they have opportunities because of the higher rate of investment, the less they will try to come to the United States. Therefore, we cannot forget the link between trade, investment, and ways to moderate immigration.
If one of the points that the President made, which is important to put into context, he said the U.S. needs to catch up. This is the first time I can ever remember that from a trade standpoint, a business standpoint, the U.S. has to catch up. When for the last 50 years, it has been the U.S. that has been leading the world to catch up. But now we are the ones who are catching up, and ironically, in our own hemisphere. Any panelists, would you like to add something to what the President said?
If I may, Mr. Secretary, perhaps just to qualify and quantify the extreme danger, in my opinion, that we as a country have placed ourselves. There's 283 FTA agreements, free trade agreements, in force around the globe today, as you know. As you mentioned earlier, in the Asia-Pacific region, there are 175 in force. 20 are awaiting implementation, and 50 more are under negotiation. Regrettably, in the U.S., both of you said, we continue to fall behind with only 11 free trade agreements covering 17 countries. I think that tells the story.
Yeah, and you know, as people criticize free trade agreements, and they'll always do it anecdotally because the numbers on a national level are good. But what you find is that the arguments against are usually somewhat abstract and somewhat anecdotal. All of those free trade agreements done under President Bush, and I believe there were 8 or 9, starting with Jordan. If you add all those up, the U.S. has a trade surplus with those countries. So these agreements work. They work for both countries. They work to create employment. And that could be one of our best economic strategies today is let's go out and sign free trade agreements with whoever is willing to play by the rules that we set out.
I completely agree on that. If we look at, in terms of small business, estimates are going to be like there are going to be 3 million Hispanic business owners. 97% of U.S. exporters are small and medium enterprises. So if we look at it, they only comprise 30% of the overall exports, but there is a vast opportunity for small business to continue to grow, specifically for in our community as well. We know that some of the studies that the Commerce Secretary has done, Commerce Department has done, is that Hispanic-owned firms in the U.S. are twice as likely to export to non-minority firms. So there is, a stronger sense of community entrepreneurship. Small business is the backbone of this country, and there's a great opportunity, and I agree. The more free trade, the more opportunity. It's not just a domestic, when you look at business, I remember 10 years ago, you would say to somebody, how's your business doing? A small business, we're doing great. We're participating in the chambers of commerce. We're doing locally great. There was no thought of, 10, 15 years ago of globally. And now, the economy is a global economy. And there's certainly now small business are looking at ways to how they can expand outside the U.S. And the more we have trade agreements, the better overall for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary.
Mr. Secretary, just 2 quick points. And it points out the importance of a group like this that bridges the gap between the Hispanic American community and the conservative movement, because we have a new Congress, new leaders in Congress, that Congressman Cantor and Speaker Boehner, who have made positive statements about moving Colombia and Panama along with the South Korea agreement. And this group, people here who have contact with them, should call upon them to insist that if we move South Korea, we have to move these other agreements.
Correct.
The second point, very quickly, is not to criticize, but of the 21 members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus who voted on CAFTA, 14 voted against it. It's just really unacceptable that we don't educate in our own community so that they understand the advantages of these agreements.
Thank you. We're going to turn the questions over to the audience now. We have time for 2 questions, and I see one right here.
Good morning, Secretary and all the honorable people. That is exciting meeting you here. My name is Elizabeth Cuevas Dunder. I'm the President and CEO of the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce of Florida, who is an infant chamber. And I am excited of hearing all these wonderful things about trade. But what has been done about Puerto Rico, which happens to be right in the middle of the Caribbean, and you mentioned Dominican Republic, but the island that gives so much to this nation has been forgotten. And right now our agriculture is deeply depleting terribly. And I am here on behalf of all of the Puerto Ricans in the island who are this moment are fighting because the land that we love is not being producing the necessary products to bring to the Florida economy and also the consumers that we have in the state here. And I know I'm excited for everyone to promote their own country, but I am here to promote mine, and I want a devoted involvement in Puerto Rico. It's an island that is very small, but we have over 3 million people who are becoming every day more and more poor, while other countries are getting richer, richer, and richer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to think also that free trade agreements with other Spanish-speaking countries in the area will also benefit Puerto Rico. But I'd like to open that up to experts within the region, others who may have a point of view on this very important topic.
Well, let me just say that it's really for Puerto Ricans themselves to demonstrate this kind of leadership, to make the island a platform for reaching out to the rest of Latin America, where they have a comparative advantage. And beyond that, I really don't have too much to say about but Puerto Rico is part of this country. And so when we advocate in favor of free trade agreement for the United States, Puerto Rico is a unique advantage, really, in terms of competing and exporting and reaching out to this market.
Ambassador.
I think this touches on the point that President Uribe made about the need for us to trabajar más integral between the United States and the rest of the region. Counting Puerto Rico, there are 50 million people who speak Spanish in the United States. This gives us the tremendous comparative advantage in working with the region. And it's actually a great moment to do it. We have leaders who have traveled in the region. Senator Coleman came twice to Chile when I was there, along with Senator Martinez. Leaders who travel in the region, notably Colombia, come away with a very strong sense of the need for us to engage in trade. That direct contact is something we all should encourage in our Congress, because it's a great moment to do that. The region has changed so fundamentally from 30 years ago. It made it in 3 very basic areas. First of all, the economies have changed massively. Most of the countries, not all of course, have abandoned the sort of utopian temptation and are working much more pragmatically to open their doors to the rest of the world. Countries have also fought back against those who want to ruin their countries through violent extremism. President Uribe deserves enormous credit for what he's done in Colombia, which has given hope to the rest of the region that you can push back against these negative forces. And finally, I think throughout the region we're seeing a sort of pragmatic centrism, less ideological politics, and a politics focused more on solving real problems. If you look from the top of the hemisphere, Prime Minister Harper, a conservative president who is very heavily engaged in poverty reduction in Latin America. You have President Calderon, a conservative president who wants to be known also as a leader of environmental issues. You have President Piñera in Chile, a conservative president also heavily engaged on the environment. Even President Funes in El Salvador, representing the FMLN, is trying to attract U.S. investments. So we have a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of this increasing pragmatism in the region and engage more effectively through trade.
It sounds like there is a center-right movement in Latin America as well. One more question from the audience, please. Yes.
Hi, good morning. My name is Malvina Gasco. I work for the Boeing company. In terms of value, we're this country's largest exporter. And my question to you is something that was brought up by the panel before. Why is there such a gap in trade education with our members of Congress? I mean, it seems like, at least from our process, every time there's a re-education, there's sometimes a bad connotation when it comes to trade. And with groups such as, for example, the Chamber of Commerce having strong programs on trade, there's still a big gap. So I'm curious, based on your experience and your education, what is your assessment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Perhaps a couple of different ways to answer the question, Malvina, but I'll begin by echoing the concerns that Ambassador Noriega mentioned with regards to the unfortunate bad scorecard we have with Hispanics on free trade votes in modern political times. I think it's a travesty, and we got to fix it. I will tell you that given the good work that we did under Secretary Gutierrez when we were trying to get DR-CAFTA ratified, which, as you remember, many of you in this room participated very actively in that process. We won, but we rarely won by a big margin of one vote. I mean, one vote in a body of 435 members of Congress, we definitely sweated that one, as we all know. I think looking at it retrospectively, I think if I were to vote on the biggest misnomer of all times, I'd say that the biggest misnomer term is probably free trade, because after many years of laboring in that effort, I tell you that we all want it to be ultimately free. We all work hard to have a free trade environment, but we all know that rightfully so, every government works hard to try to protect its own and transition in a process industries that perhaps are less sustainable in one country, more sustainable in another country, given whatever business or economic or political climate might exist. But we can't expect that overnight countries get rid of industries and bring new ones. So the process of negotiating free trade agreements has been extremely well opposed, let's say, by the opposition. It did a darn good job demonizing the term free trade. I mean, the FTA probably today is analogous with among the worst curse words in history, because some of our friends in the region and others tried aggressively to create that negative connotation. Going forward, I suggest to you that I think we got to find a way to have nations be less defensive, less on edge, because it's not free, it's enhanced trade. And I think if we improve the marketing campaign on how to sell these trade agreements, we're going to definitely improve the scorecards of our members of Congress, because it's not that they're afraid of anything or afraid of the opposition, it's that they rightfully so want to get reelected. We need them to get reelected. Historically, trade has been a vote detractor, not a vote getter. So we have got to work overtime, which is why it's one more very good added value reason for why the good work that you're all doing under the Hispanic Leadership Network to get these issues out way ahead of time, way before the cycle is upon us, to get the Hispanic community involved is so crucial. But we really got to beat them at the marketing game, because the facts are there. This is a pro-U.S. export agreement in the case of Colombia, in the case of Panama, in the case of DR-CAFTA, and it wasn't easy. So I think that's where it starts, how we package it.
Presidente.
Secretary Gutierrez, leaders have to change people's perceptions. In many cases, putting at stake their own popularity. I remember at the very beginning of the year 2006, we were next to close negotiations with the United States. 3 weeks before the congressional elections, 2 months before the presidential elections, and I was running for being re-elected. And one of my advisors came to see me, Mr. President, you should not close negotiations with the United States because we have these polls. 56% of Colombians are opposed to the free trade agreement with the United States. It only has 27% of approval. And my answer was, we cannot postpone the closeness of the negotiations. We need to close the negotiation right now. It is necessary for us to explain to the people the advantages of the negotiations. Democracy, elections are not to hide the problems. Elections are for people to discuss the main issues. And I remember that we closed negotiations, and two days later I called to one TV channel and I said to them, will you allow me to go on live TV at the time you prefer to answer all the people questions to our free trade agreement with the United States? And they were surprised. And finally, they said, yeah, Mr. President. And my reaction was, at what time? No. Our lowest rate of viewers is in between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. And my answer was, I am ready. And I went to this TV channel at 11 with some of my colleagues of the cabinet. And we received all the night questions from people, from many people opposed to the free trade agreement. And with patience and pedagogy, not with demagogy, with pedagogy, we step by step change the people perception. It is necessary to overcome obstacles. For instance, many journalists of the public sector in my country, for ideological reasons, are opposed to the free trade agreement. But in the private sector, there are many who want and who have been convinced about the advantages of this agreement. And we promoted them. We made them visible. It is necessary to convince the people, to discuss with the people, to reach the people with logic explanation, with pedagogy, to defeat the demagogy with pedagogy, and to create a coalition, in this case, with the small enterprises, with the students, with the economists, with politicians, and with those in the working sector, in the private sector, opposed to those with ideological misconceptions against the free trade agreement. Coalitions, and pedagogy.
And there was a time when there was the public sector workforce was very much against the free trade agreement. So there is a way of convincing Congress. What I would say, just maybe as a final comment, that this has to be done company by company, factory floor by factory floor. It's very hard to make a point on trade on a national level. It has to be company by company. Tell employees how their job is tied to trade. I can't imagine that Mexican Americans like what's going on with the Mexican trucking problem, where we are not abiding to what we agreed to when we signed NAFTA. But I don't hear Mexican Americans being engaged, even though they have every right to be engaged. I know how Colombians feel about the free trade agreement being held for 3 years. Colombian Americans, the Colombian community, Panamanian Americans, the Panamanian community, how do they feel? Why aren't they saying something about these, what I would consider to be a very center-right issue, trade, and a center-right issue in which we can be in agreement with a large portion of our community. So thank you very much for listening to us. I hope this is something that you will take with you and understand that this too is important to Hispanic Americans, and if it isn't, someone needs to explain why it should be. So thank you again. Thank you very much.